the solution. And we'll actually talk about the two parts of the solution. So what does our solution need to provide? Finding information. We need the system, we need the solution to be able to locate information. All the information that we're going to need that feeds into our compliance process for content. Once we've identified its location, we need to identify what it is. And we need to persist that identification through the application of metadata. That's how we do it, right? Data about data. So we need to persist that in some fashion. We need to assign the policies. So once we've identified the content, identifying the content is all great and allows us to have a better search return. But the point is to assign the appropriate policy to the information. So once you know what the information is, you can use the taxonomy mapping that you should have developed by now. Between the data, it is this kind of document, and the policy that that kind of document should have. Most people have the policies written somewhere, and most people have a definition of the information they think they have or they need to have. They just don't actually have the association of those two things with the content itself. You need to locate it, make the assignment, and persist that assignment. And then your system needs to be able to execute whatever policies that may be. If it's a security policy, then the people that need access have access, the people that don't need access don't have access. Or if it's disposition, retention, accession, expunging. And then throughout the whole thing, the system has to be able to audit all the actions that are taken on your content. I don't think I stressed that in a particular fashion. I want to bring that up. Is it important to audit the actions for all content or just the content that's important? Depends.
Well, I mean, for me, it's all not necessary.
The what?
You don't have to audit actions and not required by the regulated industry.
Right. You don't have to audit actions unless it's required by that particular process. So,
surely it depends how well you know that you're covering that already.
right. It depends on how well you know your process and the importance of that information.
Also depends on the reason why you're actually attempting compliance. Because if it's ISO 27001 data compliance, then presumably all of your data falls within.
Right.
within that
So
schema.
if it's for instance an ISO 9, I'm repeating it for the mic, ISO 9000 compliance information, then it depends on whether or not that data applies to that particular.
Yeah, but that's why I said 27001, because 27001 is a data security standard.
Oh, the data security standard. Yep. Absolutely. So my response to my own question in view of that is that you need to audit the actions of all content, because you never know whether or not that piece of information is going to change in importance later. Right? People look for ways to cheat. You look for ways to reduce the amount of auditing overhead and storage and threshold. You look for ways to avoid doing that. But the reality is that what is important today may not be important tomorrow, and what is risky today could end up encompassing information that is not risky now. The context of risk is constantly changing.
But the price tag, it might be fair to pay.
Right. But and that goes into the regulated industry scenario, right? And that's why I back it out. Does every organization in the world need to be able to build a complete content lifecycle auditing mechanism? No. Many organizations are not going to need that level of investment. But my response is that for a regulated industry, you do. You need it. Because compliance is more important than the economic considerations of the business. In some cases, the economic considerations don't even exist. It doesn't even matter how much money you spend as a government agency. The questions are never, you spent too much. I mean, look at the discussions that are being had, in the United States. Sequestration. Everybody's up in arms about sequestration. They trim the budget down, and the budget is still $20 billion higher than it was last year, even after the cuts. It's not about the volume of money when it comes to taxpayers. It's about how it's spent. Did you follow the policy? Are you compliant in its execution? Are you doing something that the taxpayers have expressly said that they don't want done with that money? It's not about the volume. Yeah. Well, after the fact. We almost always have the choice after the fact. So we don't reward predictive switches. We punish the ignorance of making the choice before we have a chance to make the choice. But we're not going to get into that form of governance. We'll leave government governance out of the conversation for now. But I would say that for a regulated industry, you need to be able to at least audit and identify and track information that might be important at some future date. And since it's almost impossible to predictively analyze all the possible risks that information could hold, at a minimum, even if it's deleted, destroyed, changed, removed, whatever, before it was important, that's why the auditing is so critical. You need to at least know that it did exist and the reasons why it wasn't flagged important at the time. It's all about culpability. Compliance is maintained, risk is managed. That's what we're going for. In the regulated industry content management system, compliance is maintained, risk is managed. So, this goes into one of the conversations, one of the things that we kind of touched on earlier. When should you start the process of governance and compliance, or governance, because the end state of governance is compliance? When should you introduce the process of defining your governance plan, incorporating those thoughts into it? Now, there isn't any one time. I would say, you start as early as possible. You want to start as early as possible in the process because the compliance requirements that drive your governance process will have a direct impact on the technology implementation that you're guiding. For instance, last year my company implemented a localized cloud for a Department of Defense organization. There are 36 government agencies that are part of the same network that will be consuming services from that particular cloud. And so the process of architecting that solution was driven by the compliance regulations that were being driven by the fact that each of those 36 organizations needed to have a high level of disparate management boundary, which meant that the structure for the SharePoint farm and the SharePoint site collections were site collection based. We had more site collections and we had all the multi-tenancy features turned on. This is exactly the same. This is the regulated industry scenario, and they needed more transparency around that and be able to report and audit that more. But it's exactly the same as setting up a cloud host for hosting any other kind of service. In any multi-tenancy environment, right, you're going to have a high level security boundaries. You need to be able to keep each tenant separate from each other. Because the minute that one tenant starts seeing another tenant's information, you're not going to have many tenants for very long. So the compliance, the governance aspect will drive, in that case, a very, very early on decision about how that solution is architected. So the earlier you start determining what your compliance measures are, the more likely it is that the solution you craft will actually meet your requirements. Another example, mining company, global mining company. We implemented 13 SharePoint farms in 11 different jurisdictions. Because farm levels, could one farm probably handle the majority of them? Maybe one or two if it was just performance-based, right? If it was just the number of users that these front-end web servers would be able to, simultaneous user access requests that these front-end web servers could handle. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was that there were compliance measures that prevented certain data, certain content from leaving the country. So it can't be transited across a national boundary. Well, that kind of limits the usefulness of a remote hosted solution when the data that you actually have to keep in the country is stored in a completely different country. So that drove a very specific and a very extensive architectural change in the solution. So, how pissed off do you think these guys would be if they went down the road of implementing 3 farms, because that's what they would be able to handle for their user base, and then it turned out they had to implement 7, 8, 9 more halfway through the development project? You think that's going to alter the budget construct a little bit? So, the earlier in the process that you start thinking about governance as it relates to your end state compliance goal, the better. Because it will almost always affect your technology decisions. Even though governance is a bad word. I mean, it is. Does anybody here, do your bosses or your customers ever respond well when you walk in and say, let's talk about governance? Actually, I would like to hear somebody tell me a story about that being received in a positive light. Does anybody ever anybody seen a positive reaction to that? Anyone? You have?
Once where we had a chaotic phone and it kept crashing.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. At the beginning, it's always a bad thing. At the beginning, it's always a cost sink. Oh my God, it's going to be so expensive, it's overhead. And then when you walk into a customer that's already on fire, and they grip onto you like you're a lifeguard that's saving them from drowning. So, no, you're absolutely right. I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about the first time when you walk in. It's like, oh, we got this new content management system that we really want to get inside, the shiny new thing that's going to be awesome, it's going to change everything that we do, and it's going to make us so competitive. Let's talk about governance. Oh, God, why do you always bring that up, Brad? So, as early as possible. Risk management is the end state objective. Now, I know I'm up here, and I got the slides, and I got control. I'm governing you for 60 minutes per presentation, and I'm making some very definitive statements, right? The end state objective is risk management. Obviously, that's a simplified response, right? I know that. We all know that. But in a regulated industry, specifically around what we're trying to solve in this session, what I'm trying to get you guys thinking about these solutions, for this, is that if you're implementing a content management system, risk management should be, for a regulated industry, at the top of the list or near the top. I mean, the end state objective is to make sure that when we're implementing technology, it doesn't become a burden. It's not burdensome, but, and it provides value, makes us more competitive, increases in process improvement, makes things happen faster, better. But in the end, you have to do that in a risk-averse fashion. You can't encompass too much risk in that. And in the end, the risk versus reward calculation for a regulated industry, they're not looking for huge rewards in the first place. Their reward is being allowed by the government to continue to do business. So, or in the case of a full governmental agency, their reward is to be allowed to continue to get a budget and to not be audited and to get promoted. People inside it, they're looking for promotion. So when I simplify this down, compliance and governance, a solution for information management for regulated industry, risk management is the end state. If we manage our risk, then everything else has a tendency to come by the board. 2 points. There will always be having things go wrong. Things will always go wrong. You're never going to be 100% compliant. There's always going to be something that goes wrong. The question isn't whether or not you can prevent everything from ever happening ever. The question is what happens when something goes wrong. Why do you think I focus on that auditing so much, that proof? The reason why the proof is important is when something goes tits up and everybody's worried for their job, and there are people sitting on the congressional floor with a senator who has no idea what the hell his ass is from his elbow, and he's asking you, why did you screw up? Why did you do this? Why did you do that? When you're sitting in those kinds of scenarios where you could end up in Fort Leavenworth for 25 years of your natural life, auditing in a regulated industry, you got to support it. You have to prioritize it. You got to be able to prove it because things will go wrong. You run with the assumption that you have to respond to a lack of compliance because you'll never be 100% compliant. And the risks of content change with context. We talked about this a little bit in the previous session. What is risky now may not be risky in the future, and what is not risky now could be. The security aggregate is one of my favorite examples of that. Individual document, but it's not going to damage your organization if it gets out publicly in any significant way. But you get 800 other documents of other types of information, and when you look at it all in one picture, it does a massive amount of damage to your organization or to your country. The policy for information needs to be able to adapt to the changes of risk that information can occur, the changes in risk to information. So your system, this system, has to be able to adapt a policy change. So we're talking about finding information, locating it, identifying that information appropriately, assigning the right policy, and then managing that policy moving forward so that if it needs to change, it changes with the minimal user input required. Well, let's solve world hunger while we're up here. When it goes bad. That's a picture of cocking it up, Example 1, starting at the end. The most common mistake that I see organizations make around governance in regulated industry is starting at the compliance and moving backwards. They start implementing the compliance measures, the compliance technologies, and moving backwards. Let me give you an example. So, records management. Who here has gone through a records management implementation or has been involved in one in any way? Raise your hand, please. Records management. Was it fun? Pleasant? Successful? Right. So, if you have a boss that comes down or a customer that comes in and says, we need a records management system, let me back that up. The entire United States just had their boss come down and say, you need a records management system. President Obama signed a piece of legislation last year called the the Government Records Management Compliance Act, which said that by the end of by December 31st, 2014, you will have an electronic records management system. By December 31st, 2016, all of your electronic records will be managed using that system. And by December 31st, 2019, you will have no more physical records. They will all be digital. I love it when they come up with stuff like that. I started getting a lot of phone calls around that time. So they're forcing the change that you must have a records management solution, right? So the conversations invariably turn to, hey, Brad, Black Blade, can you come out and do an assessment? We need to implement a records management solution by the end of the fiscal year, which would be October 1st this year. I said, really? Records management, huh? 6 months? It's like, yeah, we're talking with a bunch of vendors. They have records management solutions. We can just install it right now. You know, OpenText, Trim, Gimel, Documentum. I especially love encountering the Documentum sales guys. Those guys are fun. They come in and they say, if you need a records management solution to be compliant with this new directive, we can install one for you, and then you're good to go. I was like, great. How do you know what's a record? Well, we already have a records repository. I was like, what is that? Here's a file share. Great. So are all the records on there official? Yep. Are there any other official records anywhere else? Well, not unless they're declared. How do you declare it? We got to move it to the file share. Does everybody know how to do that? Only the records managers. So is everybody a records manager? No. The reality is that starting with a records management system is starting at the end. You're starting at the compliance measure. How do you know that your records management system is compliant if you don't know whether or not the 90% of the rest of your content is or is not a record? You don't even know where it is or what it is half the time. So how can you even make that distinction? Well, it's not a record because it hasn't been declared. How do you declare it? Well, somebody has to identify it as a record. Do they know where it is? Do they know what it is when they see it? How can they make that declaration? How is it possible to make it? You don't know. That bites the government in the butt all the time. It's like, oh, you know, this thing was, related to the oil spill, or this thing was related to the Boeing, fuel tanker, buyout. Ridiculous. I just got to mention that for a minute. It's ridiculous. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. So Boeing Corporation built on government dime 147 mid-air fuel tankers to refuel aircraft in mid-air, and then leased them to the government. So the government paid to build them, paid for the aircraft, and then paid a monthly fee for each one to run it. And the ownership of the aircraft that they built on the government dime was Boeing. Again, why the hell didn't I come up with that model? That's what we call the self-licking ice cream cone, So it caused a little bit of a stink when that became, obvious, because you're talking about like $23 billion, So that is a great example. When that happened, when those events occur, there's a lot of litigation, there's a lot of legislation. People get pulled up for congressional hearings and whatnot over the course of 5 years. And every single time they start another investigation, they start finding stuff in people's inboxes and on desktops and sitting on file shares. All of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, we destroyed all the information related to this. And then some other person from some other office says, hey, I ran this search on here and I found these 23 file folders of Boeing-related documentation, and then people start getting fired and axed and jailed. And the problem is that the only way you can manage records is to ensure that everything in your organization that could be a record has been declared as a record. So can you start at a records management solution? No. You have to have a content lifecycle solution before you can even determine a records management solution. And in fact, your records management solution should come by the board with that content lifecycle solution. Once you've managed the lifecycle for all content in your organization, you've already managed your records because they've already been identified and the policies have already been assigned. You see where I'm going with that? Starting at the end. That's my most common. The second one is prescriptive governance, where you'll have an organization, does anybody here work for Booz Allen? Because I'm going to start ragging on them a little bit. Booz Allen is great at this. Huge consulting organization, comes in and says, well, we're going to be able to set your governance for your organization. They come in, they spend 18 months and, millions of dollars doing an analysis, talking well with, stakeholders, doing SME analysis, process definition. They produce this massive document that says, this is governance for your organization. Congratulations. And then they just imprint it and walk away. And the minute that they take their hands off it, it's out of date. The minute that they stop the process of doing that analysis, it's out of date. Of course, the organization has no choice because booze is so expensive that they can't afford to do anything after that 18-month process. But that's the whole point. The immovable object and the unstoppable force. The unstoppable force is the fact that compliance is always going to be slowly degrading, the fact that you will always move out of governance the minute you stop pushing it. But the immovable object is your budget. So how do you overcome that? With technology, right? That's the whole point, right? Robots, the robots that are going to take over and do everything for humanity. Let technology support that effort so that the cost of constantly pushing against the inevitable decline of compliance is reduced to a point where you can sustain it. That's the whole point. So prescriptive governance does not work. Who here thinks that governance is just a document? You all understand where I'm going with that, right? Yeah. What is governance? Oh, here's the plan. What's your governance? Here's the document. Governance is a process, not a document. The document helps define that process, helps you with auditing, helps you record your policies, helps you define your mappings. It's just a tool as part of that, just like your auditing database is part of your governance process. It doesn't work. My recommended solution. So this is based on some successes, because not all organizations give us the opportunity to be successful, right? The elegant hybridization of human and technology. RoboCop.
What was the drug they took?
The what?
What was the drug they took?
Oh man. That's been a while. I did watch that movie again last year though, and I have to say I thought it was a lot better when I was, 14. And drunk, yes. So the solution is a two-part solution. At no point will I ever imply that what I'm going to talk about now is easy. Okay? I'm not saying it's easy, but it is possible. And this will work. So, the human part is knowledge operations. Your organization has to have a knowledge operations construct. A team of humans whose responsibilities encompass knowledge operations. I'll define that in greater detail in a bit. The second part is your actual content lifecycle management system. I'm going to probably say this a half a dozen times over the next, little bit, but I'm going to say it now the first time, is that without the human part, the technology doesn't work. And without the technology, the human part is too expensive. You see where I'm going with this? You gotta have both. Because without the technology, humans cost too much. Without the humans, the technology isn't smart enough. What is knowledge operations? It's a team with a mission to enable and sustain knowledge management processes. For those that were in my Governance 101 talk from last year, I don't know if I still have those guys. Are you guys still in here? No? Oh. Last year, I made a very, very focused point on the fact that governance is run by people, a team of people that have the responsibility to maintain governance and the authority to do so. And then I said, that's going to be really hard for you to implement. Good luck. Yeah, it worked. So, this team is an extension of that. That governance council is a part of this team. Knowledge operations, that construct must exist. And it must be owned by the not techies. One of the biggest problems in the knowledge management industry is the fact that people think that's a technology job role. It's not. It's not. Is it? You remember before we had things like SharePoint, when we were crafting our websites around like 98, 99, 2000 with ASP 2.0 and HTML? Everybody remember that? You remember when, in order to craft your web-based technologies, you needed to be a coder. You needed to be a web developer in order to be able to code anything of any usefulness. Do you remember how usable those sites were? You had engineers that were driving the decision-making process for how something is built and used by the users. He was saying, well, the users should be able to do this, and the users should be able to do that. Why would the engineer be qualified to make that decision? Is he qualified to make that decision? Is the engineer's job to know how to build technology and to maintain it, or is his job your job? I mean, common sense, right? We don't need to, it's a rhetorical question. It has to be owned by the process owners, by the content owners, by the operations constructs of your organization. So, the CIO, the ops manager, the COO, it can vary, or it could be a grouping of those. But in the end, the people that own the process, that are responsible for ensuring that the process is running, that operations are occurring, that information is compliant, they're the ones that have to own this, because they're the ones that own the requirement. It's not a technology problem. So, knowledge operations does not report to network operations. Let me restate that. Knowledge operations doesn't report to network operations. It reports to corporate operations. So the responsibilities. What is the knowledge operations construct responsible for? Well, primarily three things. There's a lot of items underneath them. There's a lot of additional detail. There's other things that you'll be able to do. But these are the ones that I want to call out as the biggest justification for knowledge operations. Systems architecture. They're responsible for the architecture of the system that is managing knowledge operations. So, you remember, I just said this. I'm not refuting myself. I just said this. Knowledge operations is not a technology construct. But there are technologists in it. Okay? Not all of them, but some of them. So it's responsible for the systems architecture, your content lifecycle management system, the technology and the information structures that drive it. So who in your organization is responsible for the taxonomy to policy mapping? Knowledge operations. Remember we were talking about that, right? I don't know how, I saw a lot of people nodding their heads when I said that, right? The goal is that you take the taxonomy and the ontology, what something is, what a piece of information is, and then you take your policy designations like disposition, accession, security, context, all those other, FOIA, PII, all those other policies that you might have assigned to particular types of content, and then you do that mapping, right? Everybody's like, yeah, that makes complete sense. You need to know what it is, and you need to assign the right policy. Well, who does that? Who is responsible for making sure that gets done? Is the engineer going to understand how to do that? Is the COO going to do it himself? Knowledge operations. That team is responsible for ensuring that you know what the heck you're doing with the system. So, architectural, they're responsible for architectural structure. Not installing servers and maintaining those things, they're responsible for the architecture of the system and its design and a definition. They are responsible for governance, review, and execution. So that governance council we were talking about last year, they're part of knowledge operations. Oh, and adoption. So, this is pretty hilarious too. Anybody here at 5015 compliance or MOLBEC? Anyone? There are compliance levels for records management retention. So, in order to be compliant, right, a lot of organizations were told that they needed to have a 5015.2 compliant, DoD 5015.2 compliant records management solution. Some American oil and gas companies also have that requirement put on them by regulatory bodies for records management. When they were told that they had to do that, they installed the 5015.2 compliance system, moved some records in, and then checked the checkbox saying that their records management system was electronic and compliant. Great. And nobody used it. In order for a content lifecycle management system to enable compliance, and in order for you to be compliant, even at an 85, 90% mark, your users, all of them, have to adopt it. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every user is logging into the system, but that means that the processes and the technologies that they are using have to be tied into the system. Some people you'll just never get out of Outlook. But there's no reason why Exchange isn't part of your content lifecycle management system. Okay? See where I'm going with that? Adoption is key. You cannot have compliance if your technology is not adopted. If they have documents sitting on their desktop that will show up in court, you're not compliant. It doesn't matter how awesomely compliant your system is in the back end. So, systems architecture. They're responsible for two parts of architecture. The information architecture and the components of that, taxonomy, ontology, and the process definitions. And then they're responsible for the physical topology. When I say physical, we're talking about modern technology, so physical could also mean virtual, right? Virtual servers. But in the end, the topology of the farms, the decision, right? Going back to our example, remember the mining company, 13 different jurisdictions, or 13 farms in 11 jurisdictions? The ownership of the decision to build 13 farms and the business case justification for doing so wasn't in the engineering team. It was here. They're the ones that owned the responsibility of making that decision, owned the responsibility of justifying 13 farms because of a compliance measure that they were aware of that the engineers could care less about. Why? Because governance and compliance will dictate changes to both. So we talked about that, right? Already. The physical topology, 13 different farms. The informational structures, as your policies and risks change, your information architecture, your taxonomy, you're on. Oh. Hello? Your information architectures. Your information architectures, your taxonomies, your ontologies, your process definitions, your policy definitions, those will change over time. Who determines, manages that process? Knowledge operations construct. By the way, you can name it whatever you want. I'm not saying you got to name it that. If you do name it that, and you do implement it, I would appreciate an email just to let me know, hey, Brad, there's another knowledge ops construct that's running someplace. I mean, I could call them like the Brads, something. But call them what you will. This is their responsibility. It's all semantics. Governance, process, review, and execution. These guys are responsible for making sure that this crap happens. I love that. I love Governance 101 last year and everything else. I'm sitting here, I'm telling everybody, this is what you need to do, this is how governance needs to be structured, blah, blah, blah. Everybody's, either shaking their heads vigorously or nodding their heads vigorously. They're either agreeing or disagreeing, and in the end, nobody knows exactly who the heck is in charge of it. Somebody has to own the process, right? Does a process that's not owned in your organization run? Does it ever get implemented? No. It doesn't just magically hydrate from vapor. Somebody's got to drive it. This organization, this construct is responsible for ensuring that knowledge operations actually happens in your organization. So they're responsible for policy, making sure that they stay relevant, making sure they stay documented, making sure people are aware of them, making sure that they are mapped appropriately to the architecture, which they are also responsible for. So that's why they're responsible for it. They need to own the policy and they need to own the architecture so they can map one to the other. And documentation. Needed for auditing, review, as well as training and education. And the DoD especially, every single person in the military, in the United States military, is only in the seat they're in for anywhere from 1 to 3 years. So by the 3rd year, they're gone. They're shipping to another duty station. That has proven to be a very challenging environment to try to implement knowledge management because they have a massive brain drain. Right around when they finally start getting stuff right, they go. So the process, the policy, these constructs have to exist beyond the breathing of any one human being. It can't be reliant on just one person. The construct has to be part of the corporate structure. It has to be part of the organization. If it's not, it will not be sustained beyond that strong personality that's getting it stood up. Unfortunately, I don't have a better solution for you around cultural adaptation. When you're bringing in a cultural change, a disruptive cultural change into an organization, any human group, especially one that has a tendency to be more conservative and risk-averse like regulated industry, it's going to be hard. You have to build advocacy. You have to have multiple conversations. That's a reason why I'm a consultant and I continue to pay my bills. There's a reason why you guys are all here. There's a reason why we're solving these problems, that you're interested in those solutions. So that is a process. There's a cost associated with it. But you have to drive it. You have to drive that cultural adaptation. There's a reason why people aren't getting their value out of knowledge management. There's a reason why most people think implementing SharePoint is just installing it and standing up a portal site. There's a reason why, every one of the speakers at this show, if you asked them, so what's the most common, how many features of SharePoint organizations typically implement? And they'll say less than 10%. Less than 10%. You have to have somebody that owns knowledge management. Knowledge operations has to exist. And they own adoption, training and education. Somebody's got to be in charge of ensuring that the organization knows how to use the system. That's not the engineer. Don't make your engineers go out and teach people how to use the technology for themselves. How many people in here have done training, software or IT training of any kind, internal to your organization or external? Yeah. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? I would wager that in this audience, and the audiences in the business track, more of those hands will go up than in the other ones. Because the trainers have to understand the business need. They have to be able to translate that for the business users, because the people you're teaching aren't going to be techies. They're going to be that poor old lady that's been sitting there using email and typewriters for the last 50 years, and you're trying to force her to use SharePoint. How are you going to translate usefulness for her? you have to understand what her pain points are. And you're not going to get that from an engineer. I know that sounds like common sense, right? Everybody's like, oh, of course, Brad, why are you saying that? Because everybody still gets it wrong. That's why I'm saying it. Just make sure that as part of that, knowledge operations owns that process. They are responsible for making sure that offices in your organization stay compliant through adoption of the content lifecycle management system and the governance policies. Somebody has to go and bird dog it, run it down and make sure it gets into every office and stays there. And that's the knowledge operations construct. That will drive the cultural change. And just like compliance, if you stop pushing that cultural shift, it'll start moving back to the lowest common denominator. And then they're responsible for any learning management systems. If you're talking about cost controls, right? When I say training education, classroom training is great. It's still probably the most effective method of getting input because you have somebody up there that can dialogue with you and you can bounce ideas off of. It's also the most expensive variation for this. A very cost-effective way of sustaining an adoption plan is to set up a learning management system. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a technology that had the ability to store files, documents, metadata about that and present it in a searchable interface over a browser? If you have SharePoint, you have a basic learning management system. It doesn't have all the whiz-bang features that you get out of a SCORM-based system. It doesn't have all the exam stuff, although you can skin some of that with surveys. I've done that before. But in the end, the idea for an LMS is to get some repository of knowledge someplace where people can go if they have a question and search, find, and learn things. Drive that cultural shift, and you're going to start seeing it get away from you. And all of a sudden, this process of constantly pushing against people's ignorance, you're going to instead have people coming to you and asking you questions. And that's when you know that you've achieved what you're trying to achieve. And then knowledge operations becomes even more effective. Adoption and compliance, chicken and the egg. We already talked about that a little bit. I'll harp on it again. Told you I'd mentioned it at least a half a dozen times. You cannot be compliant if the processes are not adopted, right? If your people aren't using it, it doesn't matter how awesome your repository is. If people aren't using it or feeding it, then it's not compliant. Compliance is not just the nature with which you store information. It is also the processes of guaranteeing that it's getting in. The information is being updated and being inputted and being destroyed. It has to move in step with the pulse of your organization. If it's not, then you're not compliant. You're not. Adoption has to be owned for it to succeed. A lot of people talk about there's adoption conversations. Steve is very, very big on adoption. He goes into organizations often and talks through the process of establishing adoption, but that has to be owned. You cannot it can't be force-fed to your organization. It's got to be owned inside by the operations of your organization. Knowledge operations. If it's not adopted, compliance is impossible. An example, we had a USAF functional. Real quick, I'll explain that a little bit. The Air Force in the United States has organizational structures, a hierarchy, right? There's the 4-star at the top, the Secretary of the Air Force, who's a civilian appointee, from down, and there's a hierarchy of commands, and there are major commands and stuff like that. So there's the organizational structure of the Air Force, but then there's this other cloud of other commands that are called functionals, which are focused on a particular task that can report to one or many or none of the people inside the pyramid of the hierarchy of the Air Force, the big Air Force. So those functionals have particular jobs, and oftentimes they have a tendency to be much more focused on certain things. This particular one, which I'm not allowed to say the name of, nor am I allowed to tell you where it is, nor am I allowed to tell you what they do, but suffice to say they're pretty interesting.
Area 50.
Huh?
Area 50.
No, not that interesting. Yeah. You got to wonder, though. I wonder if they brought a records management system with them when they crashed.
Where do you think SharePoint came from?
Where do you think SharePoint came from? Yeah. As I don't know if you've seen Bill Gates lately, but he looks a little, otherworldly. But no, this particular command had a requirement. They needed content lifecycle, and because they had a very technically focused functional job, they had a lot of highly educated people, a lot of really technically oriented folks, and so they were having a real knowledge problem. They needed a way to be able to make decisions better. They really needed to be able to lifecycle their content, and they needed a way to handle their records, because this particular organization had a records compliance that could go up to 150 years of disposition. So how do you guarantee that? 150 years. I wonder, what is SharePoint going to look like 150 years from now? They'll probably put another gear on there somewhere.
They'll move the gear back.
They'll move the gear back and forth, back and forth. But the gear will be here. You'll be tapping the front of your forehead, to use it. But that standard set of requirements. There were some advantages that I had, though, that my company had when we were implementing it for these guys, because they're smaller and they really had a need. There's nothing like a really powerful need to drive a cultural shift, right? So we provided a white paper that detailed the structure of a knowledge operations team, which they called the KM team, knowledge management team, and a system called the knowledge management environment. I wonder what platform we built it on. SharePoint 2010. And now, because they constructed the team, because we helped them get that team in place, it sustained itself past implementation. How many people here have seen in their careers a technology system get implemented and then it dies on the vine? That never happens, does it? That team keeps it alive. So it was a very disruptive change. It changed almost every one of their processes. Every office was affected by it. And initially, like all humans, you'd have the bosses in there, they're like, oh, I can't wait until the system's in there. And then they delegate everything down. Well, I'm not going to change anything. I want them to change everything. Then you have the secretaries in there like, I just want to use Outlook. I don't want to do anything else. That process had to be owned and managed by by that KM team. It was, and now it's mission critical, and they have as much as a 98% adoption. They got ROI. They didn't have to come up with some whiz-bang, crazy, scenario for generating a return or a proof of the investment was worth it. They got it through adoption.
Were they told at the beginning that you were going to be mission critical? Were they told at the beginning that you were going to be mission critical?
No.
Was it in the proof that they said, oh, that's really good, now you are?
It's exactly right. They didn't know it was going to be mission critical. There were detractors all along. There are always detractors in knowledge management. Why are you sharing? Why are you collaborating? I don't need to share. I don't need this. I just need you to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, blah, 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 blah. There's always detractors, and there were detractors the whole time. But you know why it got through? You know why it got through here? Because they set up the KM team, and who do you think that these guys reported to? They reported to the CIO, to the director of operations for the organization, who was second in command to the whole functional. So in the end, they acted with his authority. He didn't do the work. All he did was have the team report to him. Do you think it would have gone as far if the CTO had been the head of that? No. Because he doesn't own the process. He doesn't own the data. He doesn't own the need. The COO does. The CIO does. So you have to hydrate that team and then make it work. Now, it took a year to get that done. And it wasn't done at the end of that. It took a year just to get this, and a level of adoption that became self-sustaining, enough justification to ensure that it was going to run. And then the compliance is just increasing since then, right? Once it gets past that hurdle, that cultural shift, that integration of that cultural change, you get to a certain point where then people know that there's value and it becomes part of the content of the structure. We know it's possible, right? How do all these other constructs get adopted in your organizations? The other teams, the other processes, they all have to go through the same vetting. It's just for some reason, knowledge management is just, for most organizations, like an experimental fringe, process. It's not. It needs to be internal to your operations. Everybody see where I'm going with that, right? So, the first part, knowledge operations. Second part, technology. Content lifecycle management system. Well, since we're at a SharePoint conference, I might as well say you can use SharePoint as a platform to do this. Is SharePoint the only platform? No. Is SharePoint the platform that we most commonly use? Yes. Most commonly used because it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Microsoft has been very good at selling SharePoint to everybody for reasons that they didn't even understand. Everybody laughs. You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a grassroots effort. Oh, God. You get records managers, you get librarians, records librarians, and people are grassroots advocates in the same room and just watch the kind of conversations that are happening. Grassroots drive people, organizations out of compliance, not into compliance. They're great. They drive need, and they build opportunity, but they cannot run the system from soup to nuts. At least not in a regulated industry. So, the content lifecycle management system is the technology that's going to make this entire process possible from a cost point perspective. The goal for the system is not to do everything. It's not to automate everything. That's impossible. We're not building artificial intelligences yet. I'll get back to you on that. But its job is to make it cost effective, to make it possible for us to implement this system in more than fits and starts when the inspector shows up to do a compliance audit. So, it has to be able to manage content, and it has to be able to manage the life cycle for all content. All content. No ifs, ands, or buts. All content, because you never know what the risk one piece of content is going to have versus another. And it's going to change, and it's going to aggregate, and it's going to modify, it's going to move, and one organization might have a piece of content that has no risk to that organization, and it might accede to the other one, and then all of a sudden it has a high risk. All content must be managed for you to manage any of it effectively in compliance. All of it. Its job is to hide the mechanisms of your information management. Hide the process. Submerge it. And when I say submerge, just visualize for a second, right? You have this complex machine. And if you have too much of it visible, it runs on water. And if you have too much of it visible, people get confused. Too many gears, too many levers, too many switches, too many buttons, too many things that they can look at, too many things that they don't understand. And that understanding breeds mistrust, and mistrust breeds a lack of adoption. The job of the content lifecycle management system, the successful content lifecycle management system, is to submerge that. So the only thing they see are the shiny, sexy bits poking out the top. And everything else is hidden underneath. It's still there, it's still running. And all you need to do is look under the water to see it and interact with it. But most users aren't going to do that, and most users don't need to. That's what I'm talking about, submerging. Define the correct scope. What is the scope of the content lifecycle management system? The scope is, well, we'll get into that in the slide. I don't want to give it away before we get there. And then I'm going to talk about an actual set of comparison criteria and the process that we as an organization go through for our customers, and the process that I would recommend that you go through as well. So, submerge. Submerge the process. This isn't technology. The technology itself is submerging the process. technology is complex, but the reality is that it's actually pretty easy to manage and understand. The complexity of technology gets fed from the complexity of the process, the human-driven aspects. So, for example, the records disposition schedule for the Air Force, a particular document and a particular part of the schedule has 4 different dispositions. Destroy when superseded, destroy when when acceded, destroy when no longer needed, and destroy after 18 months. Okay, well, the last one is easy. Destroy when no longer needed. How the hell do you process that? So those constructs need to be hidden. The process needs to be hidden from the users as much as possible so that their interactions are choices, not creation or understanding. If you require users to understand too much, then it won't get adopted, and then you're out of compliance. I've had that conversation with John Holliday multiple times. As we sit there and we drink a couple of beers, well, I drink beers because John doesn't drink beer. I drink his beers for him, and we're having conversations about, are we contributing to the general decline of intelligence in humanity? I don't know, possibly. By making things too easy, right? It's not easy yet, so I don't think we have to worry about it. I don't think we have to worry about it for a while yet. But it's not removing the human element from the equation. It's not presenting decisions to people who are not qualified to make those decisions. Just don't present them. And it has to be pleasant. It has to be done in a way that makes people happy to make the choice, happy to be governed. Everybody's seen The Matrix, right? Right? So the previous Matrix has failed because the choice wasn't presented. But in the end, most subjects took it on as soon as they were making a choice. Even if the choice sucked, you can die or you can be in the Matrix. That's the same thing. It's not the quality of the choices that really matter. It's the nature of the fact that the choice exists. So the real magic is if you can come up with mechanisms in your user experience that allow users to make choices whereby no matter which choice they make, they're still governed. Buzzwords to listen for. Things that always come up that are part of the content lifecycle management technology that are only pieces of the whole picture and are not something you can just buy and be done with. PII. Everybody understand what PII is? Personally identifiable information. So your social security number, your address, the pictures of your children, the school that you went to, your bank account numbers. That's PII. It's rather important to know that data like that exists in documents, right? Because the policy will be different for that document than for a document that doesn't have PII. What risk does PII pose to an organization? Like if it gets out. Would everybody here like to see their employee record book just dropped on the street someplace for anybody to look at? I know the Chinese would appreciate that. Collaboration. Collaboration solutions, collaboration by its very nature is not compliant. Collaboration is the beginning of content creation. And if you try to force compliance at the collaboration level, then you're never going to get adopted. And content's never going to be created. Am I running long? What time is it?
16 minutes past.
16 minutes past. Oh, wow, I am 15 minutes over. And I have a lot of stuff to go through. All right, so those are buzzwords. You guys have heard the buzzwords before. Define the correct scope. Something I want you to take away from the presentation. If you can't see everything, then you can't manage anything. Okay? Because management implies that this slice of the pie is the right slice that you should be looking at. But if you don't know what the rest of the pie is, how do you know that that slice is the one you should be looking at? There's no way to know. You can't know just one piece. You have to know all of it to determine which piece you should be looking at. All of those, collaboration, document management, web content management, records management. Oh my God, did I just hit the stop button again? Where did it go? I don't have time. Come on, you piece of crap. I'm going really long. And you know what? I was getting to the best part too. I was building up to a crescendo, and it was going to be so awesome, and you guys were going to love it.
Do you want to take this out for a second, just so you can get
Yeah.
it get it on there anyway?
Come on. Oh, okay, it's back up.
Go on then. Okay.
There we go. Thanks. All of these are all related. Collaboration, document management, web content management, records management are all part of a content lifecycle. They're all part of a continuum. Your system must be constructed to be able to encompass all of these. All of these. Real fast, because we're running out of time. Does everybody think that SharePoint can handle all of these out of the box with no additional additions? No. 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 There are gaps. But that's okay. That's okay. Because no technology system, there's a reason I call it a system, right? No technology system is a single technology. Hell, SharePoint itself isn't a single technology. We don't need to have just one technology. We just need to make sure that we're aware of the gaps of the platforms that we do have, fill them with the appropriate technology, and ensure that they map to the process of governance. Okay? I mean, in the end, you could build this entire solution from assembler if you wanted to. I can't imagine why you'd want to do that, but you could, right? It's not about the technology. They're all related, and they're all part of the same process. So, I got a couple of interesting little animations up here. Collaboration, records management, document management, and web content management. But the reality is that these two are really consolidated. They could really be consolidated into structured content management, right? So, let me label these differently. Unstructured, uncompliant, unstructured, unmanaged, but productive. Collaboration creates content. Structured content management. This is when you take what's being produced and start applying structure, taxonomy, ontology, process definitions, and policy. And records management is the end state objective. Once you know what this is and it's gotten to a certain stage of its life cycle, you need to make sure it's either retained or destroyed. As the risk increases. The risk there is low. The content risk is low because you don't even know it's there and nobody knows about it. It's being created still. When it gets here, the risk is starting to be assessed. And then when it gets out here, this is when the policy has to be acted on in order to mitigate risk. So really what we have is collaboration, content management, and records management as the lifecycle continuum. The different technologies that you can use. SharePoint provides a platform for all three. And the scenarios change, the technologies change. What is What is a common collaborative tool? Email. Email is probably the most common collaborative tool. And while it does not behave in a structured fashion, it will need to be managed from a policy perspective because the communications end up getting incorporated into structured content definitions. Cases, case management. Anybody ever done case management? Yeah. You take piles of information related to particular documents that have a certain level of risk, but part of that risk needs to be mitigated by ensuring that all comms about them are also tagged with that policy. So, when content is created, it gets structured and used, and then it gets moved into records management at the end of its life cycle to either be retained or destroyed for however long that risk is determined by policy. But what is controlling that? You know, I'm sitting here and saying, oh, it's just being put from here to here. This is traditionally how it's done, the people-driven process. So a dude is walking the content from there to there, or it's being handed person to person, and an individual human being is making that process determination. But in our system, the goal is to use an ECM, a lifecycle management tool that's responsible for brokering the communication between those two elements. Where's my little, oh, that's the next slide. So your enterprise content management system or your lifecycle content management tool, your system, is responsible for managing the information governance model. That's defined from your governance plan that's owned by the knowledge operations construct. See where I'm going with this? It inherits. Each part of this process is only a part, and they're all connected. Content is moved from collaboration to structured storage and use, process, workflow, and then it's moved to records at the appropriate stage of its life cycle. It can also source from structured content. If you're pulling structured content in or it's being generated from a form, that's not collaboration. Form-based input is structured content input. That never goes from there. It just starts right here. And so at some point that you'll just move straight in. And one of the other animations that I forgot to add, I apologize, is moving from collaboration to records, email. Email never goes through structured content definition. It just goes, it's something that needs to be aware of in the collaborative environment, Exchange, or whatever email technology you're using. Policy needs to assign and then needs to move through into the record system.
Not always the case, though, is it? I mean, you've got email that's related to a legal matter.
Right.
Then you would need to tag the email and make sure that it's assigned to the case in the matter.
You would. But as soon as you assign that, the case management, and I actually need to update that. The records management, it's not really records management, it's official information management, risk management system. Right, so as soon as you're tagging that email, you're not tagging it to put it into the structured content management system. You're tagging it and you're actually making that part of its end state life cycle because you're managing risk on that content at that point. Here, this part of the system is managing the creation of content. This is managing its use, its consumption, and its workflow and its process for actually achieving a job. This is managing its risk. So as soon as you're tagging it and you're associating it with a case management system isn't over here. Case management is part of this. So that's mislabeled. That should actually be risk management system, which encompasses a case management, records management, policy management. When you actually start moving content from, it's no longer changing, it's no longer being consumed, it's now a risk to the organization of varying degrees, right? It was used for something, you can't get rid of it, or sometimes you need to get rid of it right away. But in the end, that decision is being made by the risk management system at the end of the life cycle. A couple of other animations talking about the fact that some content can move portions of it or update information in the risk management section of the triangle. And it can bounce back and forth between collaboration and structured content, but that's when you start getting into information structures that are more complex than just one file. Right. So a couple of months ago, we recently did an assessment of records management and tagging solutions. Some of them will seem rather familiar, such as, oh, they took SharePoint out of the box off. I thought we did have SharePoint out of the box. No, actually, no, I think we do have that. This chart was rather large. I just took a snapshot of it. So, but there's only so far you can get with SharePoint and records management and SharePoint. In fact, you really can't get anywhere with SharePoint for records management. It really only does event-based retention, and even then it doesn't do it very well. It only triggers the event retention when the content changes, but it's been declared as a record. So how often is it going to change? Anyway. So this is the kind of analysis that you guys would need to do in your organizations in order to make the appropriate distinction. Because each of these criteria, and that's the other thing, I don't provide you a list of this criteria because this criteria will change. What you consider to be important for your risk mitigation will change. What you need to evaluate technology based on will change. So, this analysis, and why do you think we did a tagging analysis? Tagging. Why is that important? From those that were in my first session. What do I think, what did I say at the very beginning that what was the most difficult part of achieving governance? Right now, as far as I'm concerned, in this industry, in the current state of technology, the hardest thing to do is to identify information. And more specifically, to identify information without user interaction, without human interaction, or with a minimum of human interaction, right? How does a piece of software know what the heck something is that it just found? Well, there are solutions for that. There are technologies here in this show that do that. And like most technologies, it doesn't go all the way, but you don't need to go all the way. Remember, we don't need to govern people invisibly. We just need to make it transparent and pleasurable. If they find it pleasurable, then they'll happily be governed. So instead of taking the choice away from them and forcing them to create or to not participate at all, which is going to drive, out of compliance, you have to get far enough to give them a pleasurable selection of choices. So there are technologies that do that, and analyses can be done. If your consultants aren't doing this, this is what they should be doing. Conclusions. Your solution must be both RoboCop, right? An elegant blend of human and technology. If you do not have the technology, what happens? It's too expensive. It's scalability through person, right? And you're just going to have too many people. It's going to be too expensive from a person perspective or a training perspective. If you don't have the people, what happens? It's not intelligent enough. It doesn't have the context. The context has to be provided. So you have to have knowledge operations. You have to have an owner of adoption. You have to have an owner of the architecture. You have to have an owner of the system. And the governance. The governance must be directed. And then you have to have the technology that makes that knowledge operations team cost effective. Knowledge ops isn't going to go anywhere if it requires 55 people. I mean, unless you're really big, or you're the US government, and really big. Without both of them, you will fail and fall out of compliance. So that is the end of 150 minutes probably now, of compliance and governance for regulated industry. I truly appreciate you putting up with it for so long. And I hope that you found it edifying. And I'm more than happy to follow up with conversations or point you in the right direction or anything I can do. And I'll be here for the rest of the week. There's a couple of other sessions I would recommend you attend. Anything that John Holliday says is worthwhile. So that's first. I would recommend that. I would also recommend that you attend the concept searching vendor presentation. I'm a particular fan of that technology. There's an adoption presentation that's being done. I thought Steve was going to do it, but I think there's another speaker that's actually doing it now, and I haven't had a chance to review the agenda. There's also Sharon is doing a presentation on a process that was going to lead into this set of presentations on Wednesday, but obviously, that got moved around. So I would recommend that you attend that too if you were interested in further discussions around compliance, governance, and lifecycle management. Do I have any questions? I know that I've kept